In the small town of Rockford, Illinois, life was typically quiet. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing seemed to escape the whispers of the community. But in the summer of 2005, something would happen that would shock the residents of Rockford to their core, a story so twisted and tragic that it would be whispered about for years to come. The story begins with 17-year-old Emily Anderson. Emily was a typical teenager in many ways. She had a tight-knit group of friends, loved hanging out at the local mall, and spent her evenings listening to pop music in her bedroom. But beneath her bubbly exterior, Emily harbored dreams of escaping the confines of her small town. She longed for excitement, adventure, and most importantly, a life free from the financial struggles that plagued her family. Emily's mother, Karen, worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat after her husband walked out on them when Emily was just 10 years old. Money was always tight, and the strain of trying to make ends meet weighed heavily on Karen, leaving little time for her daughter. This lack of attention and the constant financial stress left Emily feeling isolated and yearning for something more. It was during one of her late-night internet sessions, where she'd escape into a world of online chats, that Emily first encountered Richard Davenport. Richard was a 65-year-old businessman from Chicago, a man who had made his fortune in real estate and investments. He was wealthy, charming, and seemed to have everything Emily desired, a life of luxury and freedom. To Emily, Richard was like a fairy godfather, promising to whisk her away from her mundane life into a world of glamour. Their online relationship began innocently enough. Richard would send Emily messages filled with compliments and words of encouragement. He listened to her dreams, her frustrations, and offered her the kind of attention she had been craving. But as the weeks went by, Richard's messages became more suggestive, more controlling. He began to make promises, gifts, money, even a life together, if only she would come to Chicago and meet him in person. Against her better judgment, Emily was drawn to the idea. The allure of a life where she wouldn't have to worry about money, where she could leave Rockford behind, was too strong. So one evening in late June, she made a decision that would change her life forever. She packed a small suitcase, left a note for her mother, and boarded a bus to Chicago. When Emily arrived at the bustling station in downtown Chicago, Richard was there to greet her. He was every bit as charming in person as he had been online. Tall, well-dressed, with an air of sophistication that captivated Emily. He swept her off her feet, taking her to a 5-star hotel where they spent the next few days dining in expensive restaurants and shopping in luxury boutiques. To Emily, it felt like she was living a dream. But the dream was short-lived. Richard quickly began to show his true colors. He was possessive, demanding, and his promises of love and freedom came with strings attached. He pressured Emily into marrying him, convincing her that it was the only way they could truly be together, that it was the only way she could live the life she had always wanted. And so, in a small, private ceremony, Emily became Mrs. Richard Davenport, a teenage bride to a man nearly 50 years her senior. But the story doesn't end there. Once the honeymoon phase was over, the reality of Emily's situation began to set in. Richard's behavior grew more erratic, more controlling. He monitored her every move, dictating what she could wear, who she could talk to, and even when she could leave the house. The lavish gifts and promises of freedom were replaced with isolation and fear. Emily had gone from dreaming of escaping Rockford to being trapped in a gilded cage in Richard's penthouse. Despite the warning signs, Emily tried to make the best of her situation. She told herself that this was just a phase, that Richard's behavior would improve with time. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. The charming man she had met online had transformed into a tyrant, and Emily was left with no way out. As the weeks turned into months, Emily's isolation deepened. She was cut off from her friends and family, her phone calls were monitored, and her access to the outside world was limited to carefully supervised outings. Richard had complete control over her life, and any attempts to assert her independence were met with anger and threats. The excitement and adventure she had once longed for had turned into a nightmare. In early September, Emily discovered she was pregnant. The news should have been a cause for joy, but for Emily, it was a devastating blow. She knew that bringing a child into her already toxic marriage would only make her situation worse, but she also knew that Richard would never let her leave. She was trapped, not just for herself, but for the life growing inside her. Desperate and afraid, Emily reached out to the only person she thought might be able to help, her mother, Karen. She managed to make a secret phone call, pouring out her heart to Karen and begging for help. Karen, who had been beside herself with worry since Emily's disappearance, immediately drove to Chicago. But when she arrived, Richard was waiting. He convinced Karen that everything was fine, that Emily was happy and well cared for, and that her worries were unfounded. He even allowed her a brief, supervised visit with Emily, during which Emily, terrified of Richard's reaction, put on a brave face and reassured her mother that everything was okay. Karen left Chicago that day with a heavy heart, knowing that something was deeply wrong, but feeling powerless to do anything about it. She returned to Rockford, hoping and praying that her daughter would be safe. But the story doesn't end there. After Karen's visit, Emily's situation grew more dire. Richard, paranoid that Emily might try to leave him or seek help, tightened his grip on her even further. He installed security cameras throughout the penthouse, monitoring her every move, and began limiting her access to money and communication. The once lavish gifts and promises of a better life now felt like chains, binding her to a life she couldn't escape. The penthouse, with its opulent decor and breathtaking views of the Chicago skyline, became a prison. Emily's pregnancy progressed, and with it, so did Richard's control. He dictated every aspect of her prenatal care, choosing doctors, deciding what she could and couldn't eat, and even monitoring her weight gain. Emily was allowed no say in the matter. Her life was no longer her own. The excitement she had once felt about becoming a mother was overshadowed by the suffocating presence of her husband. Richard's behavior grew increasingly erratic, swinging from affectionate and doting to cruel and domineering within moments. One evening in late October, as the cold Chicago wind howled outside, Emily made a desperate attempt to reason with Richard. She pleaded with him to let her see her mother again, to allow her just a little bit of freedom. She reminded him of how much she loved him and how much she wanted to make their marriage work, but that she needed some space, some time to herself. But Richard's response was chilling. He accused her of plotting to leave him, of trying to take their unborn child away from him. His face twisted with anger as he grabbed her by the arm, his grip tight and unyielding. "You're mine, Emily," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You belong to me, and you're not going anywhere. If you even think about leaving, you'll regret it." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she nodded, too terrified to do anything else. She knew then that Richard was not just controlling, he was dangerous. The man who had promised her the world had become her worst nightmare, and she was trapped with no way out. As the weeks passed, Emily's fear grew. She could feel the life inside her growing stronger, and with it, her determination to protect her child. She knew she had to find a way to escape, but every plan she made was thwarted by Richard's ever-watchful eye. He rarely left her alone, and when he did, he made sure the security system was armed and that she had no access to money or transportation. But Emily wasn't completely without allies. There was one person who had noticed the change in her situation and was willing to help. Richard's driver, a man named Paul. Paul had been with Richard for over a decade, and while he was loyal to his employer, he couldn't ignore the signs of distress he saw in Emily. He had witnessed Richard's controlling behavior firsthand and knew that something was very wrong. One chilly November afternoon, when Richard was away on a business trip, Paul found a moment to speak to Emily alone. They were in the garage and he was helping her into the car for a doctor's appointment. He leaned in close and whispered, "Miss Emily, if you need help, I can get you out of here." Emily's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. She had grown so accustomed to her isolation that the idea of someone helping her seemed almost impossible. But she could see the sincerity in Paul's eyes, and for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. "Please," she whispered back, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do. I'm so scared." Paul nodded, his expression grim. "I'll help you. We need to be careful, but I'll find a way to get you out. Just hang on." The conversation was brief, but it gave Emily the strength she needed to keep going. She clung to the hope that Paul would be able to help her, that she might still have a chance to escape Richard's clutches. Richard's business trip was supposed to last a week, but he returned early, 2 days early. Emily was in the kitchen preparing a simple dinner when she heard the front door open. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw Richard step into the penthouse, his expression dark and unreadable. "Why are you back so soon?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Richard didn't answer right away. He walked over to her, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of her. "I had some business to take care of," he said finally, his tone cold. "Did you miss me?" Emily forced a smile, nodding. "Of course I did." But Richard wasn't convinced. He reached out and grabbed her by the wrist, pulling her close. "What have you been up to while I was gone, Emily? You wouldn't be lying to me, would you?" Emily's pulse quickened as she shook her head. "No, Richard. I've just been here, waiting for you." Richard studied her face for a long moment before releasing her. "Good," he said, his voice softening slightly. "Because if I ever found out you were hiding something from me, I don't know what I'd do." The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Emily knew then that she had to be more careful than ever. Richard's paranoia was growing, and any misstep could cost her everything. The next few days were tense. Richard's behavior was more volatile than ever, and Emily could feel the walls closing in around her. She was trapped, and she knew it was only a matter of time before something terrible happened. She tried to contact Paul to let him know that Richard was back early, but every time she reached for the phone, Richard was there, watching her with those cold, calculating eyes. But there is more. On the evening of November 15th, Richard received a phone call that seemed to put him in a better mood. He smiled for the first time in days and told Emily that he had to go out for a few hours, but would be back soon. He kissed her on the cheek and left the penthouse, leaving Emily alone. Emily knew this was her chance. She hurried to the garage where Paul was waiting, the engine of the car already running. "We have to go now," she whispered urgently, "before he comes back." Paul nodded and opened the door for her. "Get in. I'll take you somewhere safe." Emily climbed into the car, her heart pounding with fear and anticipation. As they drove through the darkened streets of Chicago, she couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. She was finally getting away, finally escaping the nightmare that had become her life. Just as they were nearing the outskirts of the city, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. Emily glanced back and felt her blood run cold. It was Richard's car. He must have realized something was wrong and had come back to find her. "He's following us," she whispered, her voice trembling. Paul nodded, his expression grim. "Hang on, Emily. I'll try to lose him." He swerved the car onto a side street, trying to shake Richard off, but it was no use. Richard's car sped up, closing the distance between them. Emily's heart raced as she realized that their plan was falling apart, that Richard was going to catch them. Within minutes, Richard's car had pulled up alongside them, forcing Paul to stop. Richard got out, his face twisted with rage as he stormed over to the driver's side window. He yanked the door open and pulled Paul out, throwing him to the ground. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Richard shouted, his voice filled with fury. Paul tried to get up, but Richard kicked him in the ribs, sending him sprawling back onto the pavement. "You thought you could take her from me? You thought I wouldn't find out?" Emily sat frozen in the car, too terrified to move. She knew she had to do something, but fear had paralyzed her. She watched in horror as Richard grabbed Paul by the collar and dragged him to his feet. "I'm going to make you pay for this," Richard snarled, his eyes wild with anger. But before Richard could do anything more, Paul managed to break free and shoved Richard away. "Run, Emily," he shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. "Go now." Emily didn't need to be told twice. She threw open the car door and ran, her feet pounding against the pavement as she fled into the night. She could hear Richard shouting behind her, but she didn't look back. She ran as fast as she could, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. She ran through the streets of Chicago, her heart pounding in her chest, until she finally reached a small park. She collapsed onto a bench, gasping for breath, her body shaking with fear and exhaustion. Emily knew she couldn't stay in the park forever. She needed to find help, but she had no idea where to go. She didn't have any money, her phone was back in the car, and she was all alone in the city. She felt completely helpless, the reality of her situation crashing down on her like a wave. Just as she was about to give up, she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see a woman walking her dog, a concerned expression on her face. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice gentle. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I'm not okay. I need help." The woman sat down next to her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. I'll help you." Emily nodded, her body trembling with relief. She had finally found someone who could help her, someone who could get her away from Richard once and for all. The woman who found Emily in the park was named Linda Parker, a kind-hearted resident of the neighborhood. She could tell that Emily was in serious trouble, and without hesitation, she took her home. Linda's small apartment was a world away from the luxury Emily had been accustomed to, but for the first time in months, she felt safe. Over a cup of tea, Emily told Linda everything about her rushed marriage to Richard, his controlling behavior, and the terrifying events of that night. Linda listened intently, her face growing more concerned with each word. When Emily finished, Linda gently squeezed her hand. "We need to go to the police," Linda said firmly. "You can't go back to him." Emily nodded, knowing Linda was right. But the thought of confronting Richard, of facing the repercussions of leaving him, filled her with dread. She was still shaking from the adrenaline and fear, but she knew she had no other choice. With Linda's help, they headed to the nearest police station. But the story doesn't end there. At the station, Emily gave a full statement, recounting the months of control, manipulation, and the frightening events of the past few hours. The officers were sympathetic, but also cautious. Richard Davenport was a powerful man with considerable influence, and they knew they had to handle the situation delicately. They immediately issued a restraining order against Richard and arranged for Emily to stay at a safe house until they could determine the next steps. For the next few days, Emily remained hidden, the fear of Richard's retribution never far from her mind. The safe house was a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of the city, but it was secure, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily could breathe without looking over her shoulder. Linda stayed with her, providing much-needed comfort and support, and the two women quickly formed a close bond. But the peace was short-lived. Richard was not the kind of man to let go easily, and when he realized that Emily had gone to the police, his rage knew no bounds. He used his connections to try and track her down, determined to bring her back under his control. His efforts, however, were in vain. The police had taken every precaution to keep Emily's location secret, and for a time it seemed as though she might finally be free. In early December, just as Emily was starting to regain some sense of normalcy, a report came in from one of the detectives assigned to her case. Richard had been spotted near the safe house. The news sent a wave of terror through Emily, and she knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. She had to take control of her life, not just for her sake, but for the sake of her unborn child. With Linda's encouragement, Emily decided to go public with her story. She reached out to a local news station, and within days, her face was on television screens across Chicago. She told her story with courage and honesty, revealing the horrors of her marriage to Richard Davenport and the fear she had lived with for months. The interview sparked outrage and sympathy from the public, and the pressure on Richard began to mount. Richard, now cornered and with his reputation in shambles, grew increasingly desperate. His once flawless facade was crumbling, and the man who had always been in control was now spiraling. The public backlash was severe, with protesters gathering outside his penthouse, demanding justice for Emily. His business partners began distancing themselves, and the media hounded him at every turn. Richard's world was collapsing, and he knew it. On the evening of December 22nd, just 3 days before Christmas, Richard made a final, fateful decision. He could no longer bear the humiliation, the loss of power, the thought of Emily living free from his control. He had to end it once and for all. That night, Richard broke into the safe house. The security measures that had protected Emily for so long failed, and he managed to slip inside undetected. Emily was asleep in her room, exhausted from the emotional toll of the past few weeks, unaware that the man who had terrorized her was just a few feet away. Richard crept through the house, his footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. He made his way to Emily's room, his hand gripping the handle of the knife he had brought with him. His mind was a haze of anger, jealousy, and a twisted sense of ownership. He had lost everything because of her, and now he was going to take everything from her. Emily awoke with a start, sensing someone in the room. She saw Richard's silhouette in the darkness, the glint of the knife in his hand, and knew immediately what was about to happen. Fear surged through her, but so did something else: determination. She wasn't going to let him take her life, not after everything she had fought for. With a strength she didn't know she had, Emily lunged at Richard, catching him off guard. They struggled, the knife flashing between them, the tension and fear of the past months boiling over into a violent confrontation. Emily fought with everything she had, knowing that this was her last chance to escape his control. The struggle was brutal and desperate, but Emily managed to knock the knife from Richard's hand. In the chaos, she scrambled out of the bed and ran for the door, screaming for help. But Richard was on her in an instant, tackling her to the ground. They fought, their bodies crashing into the furniture, both of them determined not to give in. In the midst of the struggle, Emily felt a sharp, searing pain in her side. Richard had managed to retrieve the knife and had stabbed her. The pain was overwhelming, but Emily didn't stop fighting. With a surge of adrenaline, she kicked him off her and grabbed a nearby lamp, swinging it at him with all her strength. The lamp connected with Richard's head, and he fell to the ground, momentarily stunned. Emily, bleeding and barely able to stand, took the opportunity to run. She burst through the door and down the hallway, her vision blurring from the blood loss, but she kept going, driven by sheer willpower. Just as Richard was regaining his senses, the police arrived, alerted by Linda. Richard Davenport was charged with attempted murder, breaking and entering, and a host of other crimes. The trial was swift, and with the mountain of evidence against him, including Emily's powerful testimony, he was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his once glamorous life reduced to a prison cell. Emily, after a long and difficult recovery, gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Hope, a symbol of the future she had fought so hard to protect.